Hello, everyone. So we are now in the eighth and final part of this 8-part series called Vice Advice. And we're going to be covering melancholy and depression. But being that we're just literally coming from Passover, which was yesterday, the last day of Passover here outside of Israel, I want to first state a blessing and a hope that everybody had a freeing, liberating, and transcendent holiday. And when we say transcendent, that's one of the connections to this Vice Advice series. One of the reasons we scheduled around this period of the year is because freeing and transcendent isn't just a word. It means the capacity and the ability to be able to rise above many of the, we'll say, the tentacles of the various vices that often trap us. And the whole idea of Passover, exactly as the name implies, Passover, Pesach, means to jump over, to leap over. And the idea of Zman Cherusenu, the time of our freedom, our redemption, is about looking at the Mitzrayim within our lives. Mitzrayim, the Hebrew word, means constraints, boundaries, inhibitions, fears, anything that traps us in some way, and figuring out how to free ourselves. So beyond a literal liberation from slavery and bondage that the Jews experienced 3,329 years ago, it also is about a perpetual freeing ourselves and transcendence of our ongoing psychological, emotional Mitzrayims, each Mitzrayim as it fits each one of us in our particular way. But as we've discussed in the previous weeks, and I'll be discussing in this part as well, we don't focus on battling demons, we focus on bringing light into our lives. But at the same time, if you want it to be effective, it needs to target the challenges that each of us encounter. So to sum up what the vices were, this would be the 8th of this 8-part series, began 8 weeks ago with the first vice we spoke about was anger. The second week we spoke about arrogance, pride, vanity. Those were associated with the element or the archetype of fire. The next came the archetype of water, which is associated with desire, lust, pleasure. That was week number 3. Week number 4, we entered into the realm of the archetype of air. And we began with the idle talk, empty boastfulness, and other elements in that category. Then we moved to the next thing, that was 4. I said 4, so I have to cover 5, 6, 7. I'll go backwards. 7 was the week before Passover. We covered the first of the elements that we're now in, which is the final element, earth, laziness, slothfulness. But prior to that, just trying to remember. The subcategories of wind, of air. I'm trying to remember. Hoilus was also. I said idle talk, cynicism. I just don't recall exactly which one I covered which week. So what did I say so far? I've said number 1 was anger and arrogance, and we covered lustfulness and desire, pleasure. That was 3. Then we covered... of course, there were 2 subcategories in desire. One was coveting, covetousness, coveting others, and the final was envy. So those were 3, 4, and 5. And 6 and 7 was the idle talk and the emptiness and the empty, like air-like frivolity, we called it. And last one, the 7, was laziness. Now, if you look all across the spectrum, all these vices, literally, as we talk about them from the perspective of those archetypes, you'll see Fire is the most aggressive. Fire is a passionate, fiery attitude, which is expressed whether it's in anger or in arrogance, as we discussed at length. Water is the exact opposite of fire. Water is comfort. Water is we languish in water. Now remember, there's also a positive side, obviously, to these elements. I'm talking the negative side. And what is that? That's basically indulging in our desires, connecting to water as we discussed. Then we move to air. Air is not as strong as fire or water. Air is emptiness. It's just air. So that's a lot of like inflated, I said, boasting, empty talk, idle talk, wasting time, and that type of thing. Then we move, the final one was earth. So if a fire is the most fiery one and it defies gravity, earth is the most gravitational one, the one that falls to the earth, and that's why it's associated firstly with laziness, where you just like become like a couch potato, completely absorbed, so-called just not no mobility, no movement. And the worst side of that is what we're going to be discussing now, is melancholy and depression. So they are things that weigh us down. So anger is a vice, as is arrogance, but they're not weightful ones. They're more, they burst out in fire and in explosion. Whereas earth is much more those elements that really weigh us down. Laziness we discussed, so now we're going to be talking about melancholy and depression. And as I've said, and I'll repeat, this is based on Kabbalah. This is based on a book called Shari Kedusha, The Gates of Holiness, from Rab Chaim Vital, chapter 1, cited by and elaborated a bit by the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Tanya, in the end of chapter 1 of his Tanya. Now the connection to Mitzrayim is because all these 8 vices, and they're really 4, but the subcategories of the others, of the 4 main ones, are Mitzrayims. These are constraints. These are forces that can control our lives and impede our way to grow. Like, a person gets angry, that blocks you. It blocks you, it blocks others. It does not create healthy relationships. And the same thing with the other vices. I'm not going to go through all of them. So we're covering now the final one, which is melancholy and depression. We all know what that does to us. That paralyzes us. When you have in a melancholic state, or you are depressed, and they're not exactly the same. We'll be talking about that a bit. What they do is they weigh you down with so much pressure and so much negativity that you're really not motivated. You give off very bad negative energy. It isolates you, and all that comes with depressing thoughts. And there's no one that's immune from having some forms of this type of melancholy in our lives. Obviously, there's chronic forms and ones that completely control a person's life. I'm discussing it more in the middle of the spectrum, not extremes, which may require even medication and professional assistance. The truth is, all these vices, if it's in an area where it's more than just discussion, sometimes you do need professional help, so no one should just take what I'm saying here as a solution to it all. I'm talking about the basic principles of it, and you always need a personal guide or personal mentor or personal therapist or psychiatrist, psychologist that can help individualize and customize these ideas. So we talk about Mitzrayim, interestingly, so the whole holiday is all focused on that type of experience, which is why we eat matzah and not chametz, as I've discussed back last class, which was a week before Passover, because chametz represents humility. And humility is always an antidote to vices. Because if you look at all the vices, basically there's a self-consumption. And humility really takes the air out, literally and figuratively, from these vices. A person with humility is going to be less angry. A person with humility is going to be less arrogant. A person with humility is going to be less indulgent. A person with humility will be less, not covet, or not be jealous. A person with humility won't waste time. And finally, a person with humility will not be lazy, and also will not be melancholic or depressed. Now, of course, it's easier said than done, but that is a key element. Humility is a virtue that we can work on. Because if it's not just, okay, it's a nice thing to be humble. If you know that vices can be countered and can be healed even, and transformed through humility, you have yourself a tool. So you can't say, I don't have tools. Now you have to work on it. So Passover is the symbolism of matzah, is the humility. as opposed to the inflated, the bread that rises representing the inflated ego. So being filled with yourself, the self is always, and the ego is always the force that gets in the way. A humble person suffers from less maladies. Simple as that. You can even say it in a half humorous way, because a humble person is not as exposed, because they're humble. So they don't have any ears about them. Like one person came once to the Tzemach Tzedek and said to him, Rebbe, everybody's stepping on me. When I go to the shul, everyone's stepping on me. He meant it figuratively. Everybody's insulting him and so on. So the Rebbe smiled and said, if you didn't spread yourself out over the entire synagogue, no one would step on you. So the arrogant person is everywhere. Has to have an opinion everywhere, has to always be loud and boisterous and so on. A humble person is silent. A humble person is quiet, and therefore does not attract all these negative forces, because humility is I don't want to say the word withdrawn, I'm just trying to say it's a diminished sense. It's like you're not open for target practice because you're a humble person. And it's not about you. If it's not about you, then generally speaking, most of the vices disappear if it's not about you. As soon as you are the factor, obviously every vice, I was insulted, I was humiliated, I was this, I was that, this is unfair, that person has more than I do. All the vices result from that. Second interesting thing to mention, and not just to mention, is on the second day of Passover, not by accident, Memochers HaShabbos is the verse that in the chapter Omer in Leviticus, we begin counting the Omer. It says Memochers HaShabbos, and the sages derive that it means Memochers HaPesach means the second day of Passover. This is the second night of Passover. We begin to count. A count that goes from 1, which will go for 7 weeks, 7 times 7, 49, concluding with Shavuos, that the 50th day will be Shavuos. It's the only holiday that's dependent on our counting. All other holidays are dependent on the new moon, and then 15 days from the new moon is Passover. 15 days from the new moon of Rosh Hashanah is Sukkot. Shavuos is so-called as an outgrowth of the 49 count. So I did the book called The Spiritual Guide to Counting the Omer, which has become very popular. Actually, it grew out of this class because people asked me, what is this chesed shebechesed? Every one of the 49 days has this cryptic Kabbalistic reference to our divine attribute. Kindness within kindness, discipline within kindness, compassion within kindness. So what I did was I did research this going back at least in 1996 maybe. And I handed out each week of the 7 weeks of the Omer that week's so-called workbook. And that later became, a long story short, they became the book called The Spiritual Guide to Counting the Omer, which is the essence of it is that when the Jews left Egypt, they began counting down out of anticipation to receiving the Torah. But it goes deeper than that. They worked on themselves. And each one of the 49 days takes a attribute, a personality, a characteristic of the human being, and examines it. You examine, for example, in week 1, your love, the way you love. Do you have the measure of discipline within your love? Do you have compassion within your love? Do you have endurance within your love? Do you have humility within your love? Humility being the 5th of these 7 emotional characteristics. And it's a fascinating experiment, a fascinating journey, I would say, because when you get to the details, you suddenly realize, you know what? I love, but I'm lacking certain elements in my love. Or I have good, healthy discipline, but I'm lacking certain elements in my discipline. And when you go through it, you really can identify, literally like a medical examination, here are your strengths and here are your weaknesses. As a matter of fact, out of that grew out an app that we created, My Omer app, it's called. My Omer. You can get a free app on your iOS or Android. And there, with a journal, and answering the questions that I have in that book, which is every day going through that day and asking yourself these 4 or 5 questions about that attribute within yourself, and you really get a picture, a snapshot of yourself in a very fresh and new way. And the connection to Passover is obvious. Not just technical. That's from the second day, because Passover is all about getting out of our constraints. And our first initial constraints are our emotional patterns and our emotional habits and our emotional vices. So we talk about Birur Hamidus, refining oneself. Passover gives us the strength. So after 1 day of Passover, we go right into the second day and we begin to count. But it's more than just a count. As I've explained a number of times, The word sphira to Omer, to count the days, sphira also has the meaning lesaper, to tell the story, sipur. And there's a third meaning in sphira, and that is to illuminate, from the word sapphire, even sapir. So the count is more than just you're counting days, you're actually telling a story, which of course is immediately reminiscent of Passover, which is telling the story. Lesaper b'yetzias Mitzrayim, to tell the story, sipur, lesaper. So you're telling a story, not just counting and examining that respective emotional characteristic, but you're also trying to understand its story in your life, its narrative. And then with the ultimate goal of becoming an illuminating element. So if it's a negative attribute, something that you weaken, you refine it to make it shine. If it's a positive one, you obviously improve it and polish it to make it shine even more. So the counting of the Omer is more than just a count, it's also a narrative and an illumination. As the Pardes and others explain these three meanings in the word sphere, counting. So coming from Passover is the perfect next step. Passover is the launch pad, the two Seders outside of Israel, the Seder, which is a 15-step journey toward freedom. Each step of the way that we, in the Seder Haggadah, part of it is telling the story, of course, a big part, Magid. Haggadah means to tell the story. And then on the second day of Passover, with that strength, we begin the detailed process of 49 days of counting. So Passover ends, the counting continues. Essentially, we begin the second week after Passover, the week of discipline. Then comes the week of compassion, Tiferet. Then the week of endurance, Netzach. And then the week of humility, Hod. And the week of Malchut, which is the final seventh week, the week of dignity or majesty. So in my little book here, The Spiritual Guide to the Omer, we actually go through each one of these steps. So it's very apropos to talk about the vices, therefore, because that's what we're doing. We're trying to refine the midas, as they say, of the nefesh habahamis, the vices, or the emotional, flawed emotion of the animal soul, the selfish animal soul that is concerned with one thing and one thing only, its own survival, its own pleasure. So with that, let us go. I already did the first 7, so I don't have to go through those. We'll go to number 8, which is melancholy and depression. So first let's define what they are, and as we've done in the past weeks, in the earlier parts of the series, we also define, do they have anything positive about them? How can we harness them? And so on. Because the ultimate goal is to transform them, not just to eliminate them. So where's the root? What's the root and anatomy of there's depressing feelings and melancholic feelings that people have? Again, the best place, case study, the best place to begin is by looking at children. Are children naturally depressed? The answer is no. I'm not talking about exceptions. There are aberrations due to different reasons. Children learn negative feelings of depression or melancholy from those around them. When you see a parent is depressed, it's more likely that the child will learn how to become depressed when certain things happen. When they see a cheerful parent who knows how to buffer the negative things in life and not let it get to them and get them down, the child learns that as well. Now, obviously, we all go through ups and downs. So there's always a merry-go-round. Life is a roller coaster. I was going to say merry-go-round. Roller coaster is the right word, of ups and downs. The question is if they really get to you. If it becomes a permanent feature in your life that you get depressed by things. Something happens and you're down. You're in a funk. Not just in a funk, but it really weakens and demoralizes you. So I think to understand it well, let's define it by contrast. Is there a healthy form of so-called melancholy? And is there an unhealthy form? The answer is absolutely yes. In Tanya, beginning from chapter 26, the few chapters after that, the Baal HaTanya Reb Shneur Zalman, in a very brilliant and poignant way, describes the difference what he calls atzvus and merirus. Atzvus is the word we're using here for melancholy or depression. The word he uses, the same expression he uses at the end of chapter 1 in Tanya. And merirus can be translated bitterness, like morar comes from that word, but the true right definition is sadness. So what's the difference between sadness and depression? There's one key difference. One is empowering, and the other is demoralizing. and let's just make this the rule. Anything that demoralizes the human spirit, the human condition, the human being, rest assured is coming from an unholy place. What he calls the other side, from the Yetzer Hara. Because it doesn't have any benefit. All it does is demoralizes you. It weakens you. Sadness, on the other hand, the sadness we're talking, I'm using the word, obviously there can be unhealthy sadness. I'm talking about a healthy form. Sadness is the feeling that not of just being demoralized, that you feel motivated. You may feel sad, you're missing something, and it motivates you to do something about it. You know, sometimes it could be described, it's not exactly, but similarly, healthy shame and unhealthy shame. So there's a lot in psychology, in the recent years, talk a lot about shame. You hear this a lot in AA, in the 12-step programs. Children who grew up in homes where their fathers or parent was alcoholic, to the point that they were out of control. Many of these children talk about the shame of it, seeing a parent out of control, seeing a parent coming home completely wasted, hiding the fact from their friends. Like, you know, you want to go play by your friends, and they say, let's play by you this. No, we can't go home. And you keep this big dark secret, and shame, terrible shame enters. This shame is also associated often with people's experiences, even sexual experience that were inappropriate. You carry the shame like an ugly secret, a dark, ugly secret inside of you. And shame is a very debilitating element. I have to do more research to say if I could associate shame with depression, or I wouldn't say with depression, but with this element and that an archetype of atzvus, of offer rather, of earth. But it may go into that category because it doesn't fit in the other 7. But I'm just, so for argument's sake, let's not call it depression or even melancholy, but it's also a dark thing that weighs you down, shame. And people talk about in many different instances, things we've witnessed in our homes, and we carry, this is unhealthy shame, because it's demoralizing, it's weakening, it's embarrassing, it's humiliating, it makes you feel terrible. And you feel worthless, actually. You feel like out of control, you're not in control. Healthy shame, by contrast, is a very different experience. Healthy shame would be, you meet your friend after you haven't seen him for 20 years, or her for 20 years, and you see they've achieved greatness in some way. You see yourself that they haven't achieved that greatness, so there's a certain shame that almost like that is a motivator. You almost feel a healthy type of competition. Look what that person has accomplished compared to what I've accomplished. If it demoralizes, again, it's a negative form. But there's a shame where you're standing in front of something great and you stand, I'm embarrassed that do I deserve even to be here? But that's a feeling not of demoralization, that's a feeling of uplifting feeling. But one feeling that I have to earn my way. So healthy shame is very different than unhealthy shame, because healthy shame will motivate you. It'll push you. It'll be like a catalyst and saying, look how much I could have accomplished and I haven't accomplished. Now, some people take that feeling and turn that also into negative. But that usually will be a sign that the person is across the board sees everything in negative terms, that someone else has better opportunities than I have, and the envy that comes with that, and other such arguments. So, bottom line is, sadness that comes, a person cries over a loss, and it comes from a place that is strong. You lost something important. And you'll see the result of that person will grow through that. Like we say, Hazorim bedima, berinu yuktzeiru. Those that sow with tears will reap with joy. Those are tears of healthy tears. It's tears over a loss, it's tears over a particular experience, and you come away feeling, okay, now what can I do to make things greater? Whereas the melancholy and depression that I'm describing, the one that weighs you down like offer, like earth, is the debilitating and demoralizing, and nothing good comes out of it. All it does is an obsession with your own self and your sad feelings, with nothing coming from it. If it led to something of growth, then you can rest assured it's not unhealthy depression. But you'll see depression is a spirals to a point that you just gets out of control, where you just become so consumed with your negative feelings, and that becomes your predominant state of mind or state of heart. So that's the most important thing. So what is the root of this depression? Because if you think about it, it seems to go counter to everything we stand for. If you were created in a divine image, you're born a happy child, you're born with a sense that you have a mission and a purpose in life, why should you ever get depressed? And we go back, of course, to the root of all roots, the root of all maladies, the emperor of all maladies, the emperor of all darkness is the Tzimtzum Harish. If God had not concealed His presence from us, then we could have been in touch and we would not get depressed, we wouldn't feel disconnected. But because we can convince ourselves that we're on our own and we're not part of a higher purpose, and we're not part of a mission, and you weren't chosen, so what happens if a ship feels it's on its own? You lose your bearings, you lose your connection. It's like feeling abandoned. Think of an army. You're part of an army, and an army is difficult. There's a war to be fought. There are battles to be fought. There's an enemy. There's a threat of death. It's not easy life, but you know you're part of an army. But let's make believe the army moved on, and you think they abandoned you. That is, because then you have left with what? You're left completely exposed to the enemy, but you also have no one to turn to. You don't feel that there's anyone that cares. That's what the Tzimtzum does. It makes you create a sense of loneliness, a sense of disconnect, that then says something happens, it takes over, debilitates, demoralizes, and you feel overwhelmed. One of the key things is to turn around and realize, no, you're not. Just because you feel you're disconnected, just because you feel overwhelmed, doesn't mean you are. It just means you feel it. That's why it's vital. First, the ingredient called humility that I described before, but that's directly connected to feeling that there's a purpose in this darkness as well. Don't ever think, because your life is dark, that is the end story. That's part of the process. God is concealing Himself for us to be able to discover Him, discover the purpose for which you were sent. And that is the key thing, how to battle and realize you cannot succumb to any type of negativity that completely overwhelms you, because then not only do you destroy your own morale, but you also destroy any hope to go further. That's what depression does. It creates this message that you're sending yourself that for me it's all lost. It's all dark and down. So the connection to purpose, the connection to others, the connection to things that remind you that you were created in a divine image, that you do have a divine purpose, is a direct response to melancholy and depression. And basically saying that this Tzimtzum which God instituted is, yes, it's real, but it's not an end in itself. It was only meant for us to be able to be independent entities, so we can, our own volition and our own choice, find the truth, instead of it being given to us on a platter. And when you find it, it's far more gratifying because you found it. But this is the catch-22. The Tzimtzum God puts into place can potentially create a depressed state. But that's not the purpose. Think of it like this, the way the Kabbalists put it, they say, every metamorphosis consists of a state of being, a yesh, and a void and vacuum, a ayin, and then it leads to another yesh. A caterpillar goes into the chrysalis, the cocoon, and then from there it becomes a butterfly. You melt a piece of gold in order to shape it into an ornament. A seed deteriorates, rots in the ground in order to become a sapling and begin to grow. A mother goes through birth pangs and birth pains in order to give birth to a new child. Creativity is a child of frustration. Every creative thing comes from frustration that precedes it. Because when you want to create something new, there's some type of disorientation with the past as you move to the future. The greater the creativity, the greater the creation, the more the frustration and the confusion that will precede it. And what happens often is we get stuck in the middle and say, I'm so confused. I speak as a writer. Anyone that's done any writing or done any type of composing of anything knows there's a point where you get completely confused. You don't even know where you're going. But you stick with it. You see it through, and what happens? You finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. Things begin to emerge. And the greater the creation, the more there's confusion. So the vacuum is the tzimtzum. It's the ayin, it's the empty space, so to speak, the void. But never think the void is an end in itself. Depression is someone who gets trapped and sucked into the vortex of the void, like quicksand, and that becomes your reality. And all you see is the confusion, is the disorientation, And that ultimately turns into melancholy and depression of one that demoralizes us. The sad person will say, I'm sad over this darkness, I'm sad over the void, but I'm not giving up. I'm not overwhelmed by it. I know this is part of the process. As they say, the only way out is through. They say this about pain, about trauma, about tragedy, loss. People want to just avoid it. They say, can I just get can I have a detour? There's no detour. The only way out of pain is going through the pain. The only way out is through. You have to enter, go through it, and maintain your composure, and maintain that what's the word? The focus, the compass toward where you're going, and that's what carries us through. So, in that sense, depression is really a so-called half the story. It's someone that's allowing themselves to feed into a narrative that's totally negative, allowing yourself to become demoralized by it, and then that's that. You're now sucked into this whirlpool, and it just becomes a vicious cycle. How do you shake yourself out of that? You have to firstly become a little humbler and say you don't have it all figured out. Number two, you have to connect. What does a person do when they're stuck in a vortex like that? You have to let someone throw you a rope and grab it. You know, they tell that story about the guy who fell out of the rowboat, and he was drowning, and his friends are yelling and say, "Give me your hand, John, give me your hand." He refuses to give his hand. And he's going down. It's, "Give me your hand, you're about to die." No. And then one of the friends says, "John, tell him, take my hand." John doesn't know how to give. All he knows how to do is take. You say, "Take my hand," and take my hand. Then he took the hand. So you have to get out of the mood of taking and become giving. Giving is what gets you out of the traps. When you're in a taking mood, what happens? You just schlep everything in with you. Like a drowning victim, what happens? They pull everyone down with them. That's the power of the gravitational pull of the earth. In this case, the earth in the water, because we're talking here the earth archetype, that sucks you in, sucks you into the earth, sucks you in. So the solution is humility and letting others help you get out of it by allowing yourself to see another perspective, not allowing yourself to get trapped into your story, your narrative. That's critical. Humility, of course, is the key, because humility opens you up to other possibilities. You're not so convinced that your demoralization is the final story. So, in that sense, the vice that we're discussing here is a result of this darkness, but not seeing it through. And like earth, just gets stuck in its place and doesn't move. The other vices connected to fire, to water, to air, they are all much more mobile. Whether it's anger, arrogance, they're mobile. They have their own challenges, but they don't have that type of stuck place. I'm just weighed down by my feelings. I'm not in the mood of doing anything. I'm just going to stay in bed, or I'm just going to stay locked wherever I am. That's an earthy type of vice, similar to the one with laziness. Laziness is not quite as dark. Laziness is also I would say laziness is like a step that can lead to depression. But laziness is also a form of an earthy archetype, but not quite that intense, which is perhaps why the last final one in the Tanya is atzvus, not atzlus, not laziness, but depression. So, is there anything positive in this? That's the question. Besides the fact that there is a positive element of sadness, and as he brings in the Tanya, he brings the verse, B'chol etzev, yeah. So he focuses on a positive. So there's the positive elements of depression and melancholy are only when you allow yourself to get out of their clutches. The positive side is that you could turn that into an introspection. If you turn a state where you're not so jubilant and things aren't going so well, don't let it demoralize you. So then you could say, you know what? Let me look at why am I feeling this way? I'm feeling this way because I'm recognizing that I'm not where I want to be. And if you could turn that feeling into something that's motivating, then the atzvus, the depression, can become a positive thing. Another element of this is in the context that you see people who are more introverts are usually, whether scholars or others, are much more, as he says in Tanya, more shchera. they have more the darker personality. They're introverts, they are introspective, and therefore often have a certain melancholy about them. But that doesn't mean it has to be a negative one. It could turn negative, and then it's not a healthy thing. The positive side is like they say, for example, at night is a time to study. There are people who are night people. Night is not as exciting as day. Day, people are alive, going to work. It's light outside, it's bright outside, nice weather. Darkness brings a certain brooding element. You know, when it gets darker, the night the sun sets, you'll see people become, even on a chemical level, on a physical level, people slow down. But also on a mood level, you'll see darkness is often symbolic of times when we're more, if you're depressed, darkness is always a more depressing state, like a gloomy day, a dark day, a cloudy day. So the same thing in our temperament and our personality is a cloudy temperament is one that becomes more negative. So now it could be turned into a negative experience of a melancholy and depression that demoralizes, or you can turn it to a time, you know what, this is a good time. I'm not being bothered, the phone isn't ringing, other things aren't happening, there's no stimulation from outside, so it's a good time to focus and study. Because night is conducive, because it's a quiet time. So there's a way you can transform a brooding, so-called, more isolated state into something positive, where you could sit down and really focus and concentrate, study something properly, because as I said, you don't have all the brightness and the light and all the exuberance that the day brings. The same thing psychologically. Someone that has that type of melancholy because they just don't have that light spirit, they're not as, bouncy or buoyant. They just are, some people are happy-go-lucky and some people are very intense. Intensity does not have to turn into melancholy and depression. Intensity, when it's laser-focused, can turn into something that's introspective, analytical. You really dissect something with the goal of growing, not the opposite. So there you have the positive side, that a melancholic personality can turn to something positive if it becomes motivating to grow and to focus. And you see this. You see people who have that type of brooding personality, if they don't let it become full-blown or even out of their arrogance, it can often be directed and guided into places that are really very powerful and beautiful. But this requires work and needs to be harnessed and needs to be done in a way that has that type of element. So, with that said, we come to this eighth, as I said, the eighth and maybe the darkest of all the vices, depression. And we all know what depression can do. It can be extremely, extremely, even worse than any illness. It can be so debilitating when a person is depressed because like all is lost. They only see darkness. That's why it's so vital to understand that someone created this darkness. Someone created this tzimtzum. You're letting it get to you by looking at it as an end in itself, as if it is the only reality that exists. But it's not correct. Just like the dark, the night brings the day, so too darkness of melancholy and even the negative feelings will bring light. That's how we have to see it. That it's part of a cycle. Just like day and night, there's the cycle. Night has the power of introspection. Night has the power of the moon. The lunar power of the moon is far more, if you look at the moon, it's a far more, a mystique of the moon, even the romance of the moon. It's not like the sun. The sun is like an exuberant child, bright, hot, fiery and all that. The moon is far more haunting. People always define the moon as a haunting element. But the moon is also one of the two luminaries, and luminary that God created, and it has its own effect. You don't see it. There are plants that grow to the moon. The tides are affected by the moon. There are many, many fascinating things that science is discovering, how the moon has direct impact on the earth as we know it in very interesting ways. From a Torah point of view, the moon is what the Jewish people are compared to. They count to the moon. They look like the moon. They wax and wane. The sun is a very intense and consistent perpetual power. The moon is constantly going through phases. And right before it, as it disappears and it looks like it's going to die, talk about metamorphosis. If you stop right then, you think, oh, the moon is over with. That's if you go to sleep and don't come back the next day. Come back the next day, see, a new moon has been born. And that gave the Jewish people throughout the centuries, the ages, that hope. Which is why when going back to Passover, how did Passover begin? Very, very bizarre. You think God is telling Moses to tell Pharaoh and the Egyptians, let my people go. The plagues keep breaking them down. They're getting closer. They're getting closer to being freed. And then suddenly a certain episode happens. God in Alexandria of Egypt tells Moses, come outside. They're standing outside. It's an evening. He says, look up into the sky. This month, this new moon, will be the new month, will be the new year, will be the beginning of your liberation. He says, tonight is the first of Nisan, and this will begin a new order, the order of redemption. In 2 weeks from today, there will be the exodus from Egypt. What is this going on here? What does the moon have to do with it? What does the sky have to do with it? God says, could have said to him, tell them to prepare. In 2 weeks, we're leaving Egypt. Prepare the Paschal Lamb, all the different preparations. The chapter continues to. What's this moon thing? Why? What's the connection? But if you think about the theme, what's the theme? God is telling him 210 years, your people, my people have suffered a horrible Holocaust, a genocide, a slavery, and all the cruelty and oppression that they endured. I want them to know forever and ever that there'll be a sign in heaven that they can look at, that whenever there'll be a dark moment, they should always know, what does the word HaChedesh mean? Renewal. That they will be renewed. Shehem Hasidin L'Schadesh Kamesa. That they will be as renewed as this moon is renewed. So he's showing Moses a symbol. The same moon we look at now in the sky is the same moon Moshe Rabbeinu looked at 3,329 years ago. The same moon that shined that year and the next year and the next year, and that shined in the best of times when the temple stood, and shined in the worst of times. The moon shined also in Auschwitz and in Buchenwald and in Treblinka. And that moon was the same moon, this witness that God created, saying that no matter what is happening, the moon is a reminder there will be a new day. Depression is someone stopping and saying, look, there's no moon left. It's dead. There's nothing in the sky. The response is, wait a day. Wait till the next day. See it through. The Baal Shem Tov gives an unbelievable analogy called the Schwindeltreppe analogy. Yiddish Schwindeltreppe means swindling steps. What we call a spiral staircase. Why do we call it swindling steps? What does swindling have to do with it? So he explains. Because when you climb up a regular staircase, maybe many steps, but you see the destination. And you climb. When you climb a spiral staircase, what happens? You have to continue to make revolutions. And every time you make another revolution, you don't see the destination. So every time you get higher, you're always going to have to not see where you're going at some point. And right before you reach the destination itself, what happens? You turn your complete 180 degrees, and your back is facing the destination. And let's say at that point you've climbed and climbed for years. You say, you know what? I'm not getting anywhere. I don't see anything. And you're right there. You just need a little turn. So that's the example he gives for dark times. That sometimes you're about to reach it and you give up. Had you just seen it through, you would have had what you needed. So that's the story of the moon. The moon is exactly like that. It's a cycle. Goes through its phases. It's born, and then it begins to wax and grows. And its phases, and the angle that it faces Earth becomes a quarter moon, a full moon. Then it begins to wane. So if you don't know better, it gets to wane, the dark side of the moon, darker and darker, till there's a little sliver, then it's gone. So you say, it's over. No, you're only in the spiral staircase. You're coming just to one more step. The next step, Erev Rosh Chodesh, at that point, the birth begins. And all births begin with a dot. And then it begins to grow again. What better analogy do we have? So if you're ever in a state, analogy do we have for the cycles of life? So if you're ever in a melancholic state or depressed state, go outside and see the moon. Look at the moon. Whatever phase it's in. If you're in a really dark state, why don't you wait till the new moon and see how dark it can get? And then say, next day, as that moon begins to be born, you can become reborn as well. So God was telling Moses, by using the Chedesh Azalachem, he's telling him the story of getting out of the dark Egypt, how they psychologically, emotionally, mentally can prepare themselves to get out of such a dark place. Because after so many years, you develop a victim mentality. 210 years. This was not a small time, this was generations. And yet they did do it. So the moon becomes that reminder. But you need the humility. The moon is a humble entity. It does wax and wane, and this waning is example of cotton. Moir ha-cotton, David hu ha-cotton, Yaakov hu ha-cotton. They're all the word cotton, small, diminished, is what's associated with these entities. Because in their diminishment, in their bittul, in their humility, and their modesty, lies this tremendous power of growth that even the sun does not have. The sun is powerful when it's powerful. How would the sun deal with these phases? The sun would be completely devastated if it had to go through such a cycle. But the moon has that enduring element. And that's why it has to carry so much mystical and cosmic and poetic power in our lives. So, atzvus, which I'm defining as melancholy and depression, are very heavy forces, like earth, the heaviest of all the elements, as opposed to the other ones we talked about. But their heaviness can be turned into something extremely positive if you know how to defang it, how to tame it. So as we come from Passover, which gives us the power to transcend, and we start the count, and we're already in the week, end of the first week of the counting of the Omer. We take these lessons and these energies and this period of time, and time is energy, this power, to be able to look at ourselves in all vices. I'm focusing on this 8th one now, but all the 7 previous ones, and look at it closely, look at it in its face, take the bull by the horns, and figure out a way to firstly understand where it gets its power from. That itself defangs the enemy, because when you expose the enemy, it's always weaker. It always appears stronger when you don't know how to handle it. And if you can identify, say, here's where my depression comes from, here's where my melancholy comes from, and you can connect to people who can help you see clearer, and you can look at the moon and see the lessons from that, and you can learn all the lessons we've talked about, that weakens its hold. That weakens its hold. So with the humility and the commitment, you can forge ahead. And as you forge ahead, you'll see the depression gets weaker. Its power lies in its psychological warfare. The power, as the Alter Rebbe says in chapter 26 in Tanya, it makes you feel weak. And when you're weak and demoralized, you don't feel you can win a battle. And he gives the example there. Imagine 2 people fighting a battle, they're both equally strong, or you may even be stronger, but you're demoralized. How can a demoralized fighter fight? You've already lost the battle because your attitude, you don't have the willpower, you don't have the endurance, you don't have that push. So it's really a lot about how we apply ourselves. And all these lessons, Passover, the Omer, the moon, are all messages that help us see it a different way, and most importantly, not allow us to see it only our way. See it your own way, you're always going to be trapped by your perspective. One's perspective is always a trap. Obviously, you have to have a perspective, but you want your perspective to be enlightened and informed by fresh air, not just by your own self-defeating prophecies. So, as we come from Pesach, literally last night was the end of the holiday, and we move now into, as I said, the Omer counting. I want to wish everybody that this should be a period of time that we really can achieve that type of clarity as we count, as we climb, as we tell the narrative, and as it illuminates us, as we march toward the 50th day, which is the 50th gate, the Mount Sinai, and we grow and refine ourselves in that fashion and all those around us. So with that, we conclude this Vice Advice series. They're all archived. You can watch them as many times as you wish. They're self-contained, but they're also a certain continuum. And with that, I wish everybody to have a very transcendent week, a refined week, a counting, narrative, illuminating week. Thank you very much.